few years ago, my cousin and I decided to explore an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. We had heard stories about it, a wealthy family that disappeared without a trace in the 1970s, and the house was left empty. Our curiosity led us to enter one night, flashlights in hand. The house was in ruins. The windows were broken, and the door barely hung on its hinges. Upon entering, the air was thick with moisture and decay. We walked through the main room, where some dusty furniture still remained. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from upstairs, like someone dragging their feet. We thought it was an animal, but the sound was too human. We went upstairs, and upon reaching the hallway, we found several closed doors. We approached one, and when my cousin turned the doorknob, the door opened by itself with an eerie creak. Upon entering, we saw a children's room, with an old crib and toys scattered on the floor. But what froze our blood was a weak laugh, like that of a small child, coming from the darkest corner. When we illuminated it with a flashlight, we saw no one. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. We tried to open it, but it was stuck. We knocked desperately, until suddenly, the door opened on its own. Without thinking, we ran out of the house and never returned. A few days later, we researched more about the family. We discovered that their young son had disappeared one night, and the parents, consumed by grief, took their own lives shortly after. No one knew what had happened to the child, but we felt something dark was tied to that house. Months passed, but the image of the house and the strange laughter lingered in my mind. I decided to go back alone, driven by a feeling I couldn't ignore. When I arrived, the house seemed even more desolate, with thick fog enveloping the place. I entered and went upstairs, where, at the end of the hallway, I found a door we hadn't noticed before. When I opened it, the room was empty, but strange symbols were carved into the walls. It was then that the laugh returned, this time closer, more distorted. The air grew heavy, and a pressure in my chest made me fear the worst. When I turned around, I saw a reflection in the broken mirror. The empty eyes of a child stared at me. At that moment, I understood that the child had never left. Something in that house had trapped him. With my heart pounding, I ran out of the room, and when I reached the stairs, I saw a childlike figure at the end of the hallway. It was the same child with empty eyes. I knew something dark dwelled there, waiting, claiming those who dared to enter. I managed to escape the house and never went back. But something continues to haunt me. Every time I close my eyes, the laughter returns to my mind, and that feeling of being watched from the darkness never goes away. It was the summer of 2012 when my friend Alex and I decided to sneak into an abandoned house in our city. We had seen it a million times since we were kids, always there with its dilapidated and desolate appearance. It had been uninhabited for years, and during that time, the people in the neighborhood had started telling strange stories about the place. They said it was haunted, that at night you could hear inexplicable noises, lights would turn on by themselves, and shadows move through the broken windows. Of course, all of that was just a bunch of rumors, things adults said to scare us. We took it as a challenge, something fun to do on a boring night. We prepared for the adventure. A backpack with flashlights, some drinks, and a bit of nervousness, but nothing that would stop us. When we arrived, the house loomed in front of us, imposing in its decay. The windows were broken, the garden was a mess, and the front door hung from a single hinge, as if it were waiting to be opened. At first glance, it seemed like the house was dead, but something in the air gave me a slight chill. Still, we crossed the threshold without thinking too much about it. The air inside was heavy, humid, with a smell of mold and something else, like time had stopped there. We walked through the ground floor without finding anything too interesting. Some walls covered in graffiti, broken furniture, and dust everywhere. It wasn't until we approached a wooden door that we realized something wasn't right. The door at the end of the hallway led to a basement. At that moment, a strange feeling took over me, but Alex, as always, was determined to move forward. "Come on, what could happen?" he said, and I, not wanting to seem like a coward, followed him. We carefully descended the creaky wooden stairs, lighting the place with our flashlights. The basement was spacious, but dark and gloomy. It was filled with old furniture and boxes full of useless things. Nothing particularly frightening at first. We began rummaging through the boxes, curious about forgotten objects and old clothes, when suddenly, a faint whisper cut through the air. We looked at each other, both confused. At first, we thought it was our imagination, the typical sound of a house that had been empty for so long. But the whisper repeated, this time clearer, as if someone was speaking right behind us. We turned quickly, flashlights in hand, but there was nothing. The basement seemed as empty and dead as before. A chill ran down my spine, but before I could say anything, one of the boxes next to us fell to the ground for no apparent reason. The crash was like a scream in the stillness of the basement. At that moment, an intense cold filled the room, as if an icy draft had suddenly come out of nowhere. We stood frozen, looking around, not knowing what to think. It was then that we saw it. A shadow slipped quickly into the corner of the basement, moving with a fluidity that didn't seem human. My heart raced, and without thinking, we both ran toward the stairs. But when we reached the top, the basement door slammed shut, as if someone were standing on the other side blocking it. We pounded on the door desperately, shouting for help, but the door didn't move an inch. Panic began to take over me. We didn't know what was happening, but we felt that something wasn't right. The only thing we could do was pound and scream until, suddenly, the door opened by itself. We rushed out of there, not looking back or stopping until we reached the street. The cold night air had never felt so refreshing. Once outside, we stood in silence, staring at the house from a distance, still trying to understand what we had just experienced. We both knew something else had happened there, something that couldn't be explained. Days later, we found out the truth behind the house. The story we had never wanted to hear. In the basement, years earlier, the bodies of several people who had gone missing in the area in past decades had been found. Apparently, the house had been used by a serial killer, and the basement had been his place of torture. The stories of missing people matched what we had experienced. Something in that basement, something that had been trapped there over time, hadn't let us go. And although the house seemed empty, we felt there was something else watching us, something dark and ancient still dwelling within its walls. We never went near that house again, but every time I walk by, a chill runs through my body, as if the echoes of that night still linger in the air, waiting to be heard again. When I was a teenager, my friends and I used to explore abandoned houses for fun. We were drawn to the secluded places, the old structures filled with history, and the thrill of discovering something hidden or mysterious. One summer night, we decided to venture further out of the city limits and found an old house in the middle of the countryside. It was isolated, surrounded by a small forest, and seemed to have been forgotten by time. The structure was in poor condition, with cracked walls and a roof about to collapse, but that only heightened the excitement. We exchanged nervous smiles and decided to go in. The only accessible entry was a broken window at the back. We climbed onto a nearby structure and, with some effort, squeezed through. The air inside was stale, and the humidity was overwhelming. Every step we took echoed in the silence. The house was filled with old furniture and dusty objects, remnants of what had once been a home. The rooms were empty, but in every corner, there were traces of the past. A fallen lamp, books on broken shelves, a frayed carpet. It seemed as if the inhabitants had suddenly left, never to return. We explored the first floor and then climbed up to the second. The creaking wood beneath our feet was unsettling, but curiosity kept us moving forward. When we entered one of the rooms, something caught our attention, a large full-length mirror. It had an intricately carved wooden frame, something that looked like it belonged to a much earlier era. The most surprising thing, however, was that the glass was remarkably clean, almost as if someone had polished it recently, despite the thick layer of dust covering everything else in the house. One of my friends, Tomas, walked up to the mirror and, with a mocking grin, stood in front of it. "I'm sure something is watching us from the other side," he joked, looking at his reflection. We all laughed, But something changed in the air at that moment. My laughter faded when I saw something that froze my blood. In the reflection, behind us, there was a dark figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and an unnatural smile, staring at us intently. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I screamed and pointed at the mirror. "Look," I managed to say, and when everyone turned to look, the figure was there, clear and distinct. It wasn't our imagination. We all saw it. The figure stood behind us, watching us in silence. In the reflection, its empty eyes gleamed with a sinister intensity, and its smile stretched wider, as if it were enjoying our fear. The figure began to move slowly in the reflection, its movement strange, as if it were walking toward us. We quickly turned around, looking frantically around the room, but there was nothing there. It was empty. There was no one behind us. The air seemed to freeze, and the silence became deafening. We stood still, looking at each other, too terrified to look back at the mirror, but the feeling that something was watching us didn't go away. Tomas was the first to react, pushing us out of the room. "Let's get out of here," he shouted, and without thinking twice, we all ran downstairs, sprinting to the first floor as fast as we could, the fear driving us. When we reached the window we had entered through, we jumped out and didn't stop running until we were far from the house, panting from the effort, but the fear still clung to us. The next day, Tomas, who seemed unable to stop thinking about what had happened, decided to go back to the house to investigate further. He convinced himself that maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was all in our heads, but when he arrived, the house was no longer there. It was simply gone. The land where it stood the night before was empty, just trees and an open field. He searched the area, but the house had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. Since then, none of us spoke of the mirror or what we saw that night. As the years passed, we tried to convince ourselves that it was just a trick of the mind, an illusion caused by tension and fear. But sometimes when I look at myself in a mirror, that feeling returns, as if something is lurking behind me, waiting to appear once more. Sometimes, I feel like I'm not alone. Every time I pass by a large mirror, a strange pressure settles in my chest, as if something is trying to push through the glass and get closer to me. It's a terrifying sensation, impossible to ignore. And although I try to convince myself that it's just my mind playing tricks, the image of that figure, with its unnatural smile, remains vivid in my memory. I know that what we saw that night wasn't just a mirage. There was something there, something that was watching us, waiting for the right moment to return.